Well, Jakob, we're going to start with you. And the last time you were here, we were talking a little bit about some of, the changes, a lot of them due to the Department of Government efficiency and some of the cuts and things like that were happening locally. But we're going to talk about a story that you were starting to cover even back then. And you put this out in your March edition. This is about the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, in particular about how things might change for visitors for the upcoming season. So can you first of all give us an idea of what happened? I mean, this all comes from really federal cuts, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, Elon Musk's department in the Trump administration has, this has gotten a lot of publicity, nationwide, but massive cuts, thousands of federal employees, national park officials. And the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore has suffered a few of these cuts to permanent positions, year-round positions, including one person who actually moved here for a job that she was about to begin, and then the job was yanked out from under her. But in the case of Sleeping Bear Dunes, what may well prove to be just as or even more impactful is our national lakeshore, 30 some miles of coastline, Benzie County, Leelanau County, relies heavily on the over 100, or at least approximately 100 seasonal employees who are brought aboard for the high season. Perhaps 2/3 of the national park staff, people in uniform we see in July, are seasonal workers. They're temporarily. Typically, they're recruited, hired in the dead of winter when things seem very quiet to the rest of us, December, January, February. Onboarded, they have to go through government background checks and all this because they're government employees, and to begin working in, depending on what their role is, April or May or June when all the tourists arrive. But because of the federal spending freeze and the cuts and the threats of more and the uncertainty surrounding all this coming from Washington and the inability of national park staff to talk to any of us press, I mean, they've got a gag order. That process was ground to a halt, and in some sense, the hiring of seasonals has reopened, but very, very slowly. And so now, Sleeping Bear Dunes is trying to hire these 100 or so seasonal workers starting in March now, but typically they're receiving their job offers now or soon. It's a question whether they'll be able to come here. Also, many, it takes them a long time. They come from outside the area. It takes them a long time to find housing.
Yeah.
As of a week ago, when I published my most recent edition, what I learned was that of the 100 or so seasonal positions, Sleeping Bear Dunes had hired only 20%. 80% are unfilled because it's so late in the game to hire them, and moving here at the drop of a dime, and also having to trust the government that had let you down if you're one of these people who were hoping for a position before. They're not being able to hire them. I have heard that in the last week they've been able to hire a bit more than that 20%. Perhaps some of those to monitor the Piping Plover, which is this endangered species that it's been a really success story to bring it back to Sleeping Bear Dunes on its migratory route. But the latest I've heard is fee collectors still have not been hired. Rangers, people picking up trash at the dune climb still haven't been hired. And so, the headline in my most recent edition, your Sleeping Bear Dunes experience this year may feel very different. People who are coming in July and August, we get 1.6 million or so visitors per year. Their experience may be very different in terms of places in the park that are not open to them, overflowing trash bins, rangers keeping them safe if someone decides to hike out to the from the dune climb to the lake on a very, very hot day.
Oh, yeah.
It could be a very different experience.
Right. You mentioned the Piping Plover there, and I want to say, I think some people have this idea, first of all, that these part-time workers that you're talking about, that maybe they're more local people who just take it as a part-time job, and there might be a few of them, but they are people who come to the area for the most part, and they have maybe some specialty in a certain field when they're coming to this area as well. And you mentioned, some very, very important things like fee collections and, picking up trash. Of course, very important. But this Piping Plover population relies really solely on human park staff for protection. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that works and, about how they've been able to really help this migrating bird over the last few years and what this year might it could be the demise of this bird population.
There have been some suggestions in the media that they could be really at risk. My understanding is there are 9 to 12 spots in Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore where the migratory piping plover, which were endangered, land when they come through this area. So typically what happens is the national park staff and some volunteers devoted to helping the piping plover, they rope off sections of the dunes or the dune grass where people are not supposed to go. Our animals, our dogs, which we should have them on leashes, are not supposed to go to protect the piping plover.
Yeah.
And so there's this real fear that they'll be hurt if they come this year. When they come, the piping plover are coming regardless.
Yeah.
Doge doesn't have any. Doge is not spending. It's not cutting spending for the bird themselves. What's been interesting, I've learned really within the last 24, 48 hours that there are some volunteers, some just local citizens who are gathering, who are trying to recruit, and I'll be publishing a story about this at some point soon, who are trying to recruit volunteers who don't have a specialty but are just willing to go out there and do the legwork of taping off sections and looking for the piping plover once they begin to arrive in early to mid-April.
And, I was going to say, I think a lot of national reporting has kind of established that how hasty a lot of these federal cuts have been means that we don't actually understand sometimes the importance of the positions that have been cut or what the impacts will be when they're gone. And I think we're going to see that this year as those actually play out, whether it's at Sleeping Bear or VA offices or wherever, Social Security offices, wherever the case may be. In this case, I would say, you hinted at it, and I was going to say too, just a plug for people who love Sleeping Bear. If you're going there this year, one, take it easy on the staff if they're struggling because they're understaffed. But two, just things that we can do as park visitors, whether it is keeping dogs on leashes, especially with the piping plovers, or making sure you hike your trash out. Give an extra donation if you can, even if there's not someone there collecting fee. They usually have donation boxes, or you can donate online. I think just those things that we can do as ourselves as park visitors and enjoyers will maybe help a little bit. Hopefully we'll see some of this funding restored or these positions restored, because I think they are important. But in the meantime, there are things we can do to support the parks as well.
Yeah.
I was reminded in a conversation last night with one of these people who were trying to organize piping plover volunteers, I'd forgotten about this, that, in the depths of COVID in 2020, when Sleeping Bear Dunes closed down, technically, but of course we could still go there and hike and seek solace. Volunteers were going and emptying the trash bins on their own accord, and we might be in a situation where that's necessary again.
Yeah. And it's good to know that there are people that love our National Lakeshore that much that they're willing to go and do it on their own. I do want to talk a little more about the people that you were able to speak with, though. You did speak with a few former park staff. And what was most surprising to you about those conversations?
Yeah, key sources for me and for other media reporting on this have been Tom Ulrich, who lives in the area. He's a former deputy superintendent, so second in command up until the fall of 2023, so up until quite recently. Being retired, he's able to speak freely. But he's an incredible resource because as a deputy superintendent for decades, or at least having worked for the park for decades, he understands the inner workings of the park, of Sleeping Bear Dunes and other parks, but he also understands the inner workings of the hiring process and how many seasonalists and how many permanents. So he's been a great resource for me in that, the current superintendent of Sleeping Bear, Scott Tucker, is gagged. He can't talk to can't talk to press. Also, Sue Jennings, a retired wildlife biologist, I believe, she's been an incredible resource. And again, knowing the inner workings of the park, she has decades of experience under her belt, but can speak freely, and can speak without fear of retribution.
Right.
Which no park staff currently, will speak to me.
I know some of these. This has been rescinded of recent, but I feel like you hinted on this, Jakob, in that people are less likely to trust a government position after some of the things that have happened. So you might have someone who was in line for, say, a park ranger position or something else, maybe even a biologist position. And after all the tumult of what has happened in the last, really 60 days, people might be shying away from that. I mean, is there a fear that, even when after, this administration, whether or not things change or not, that you might have fewer people wanting to get into government service, period.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely a fear. And what Sue and Tom, who again are retired park employees, and what Julia Gehring, who spoke to me on record for my story, her position was cut on Valentine's Day. And then, another key source for me was someone who had a job with Sleeping Bear and was let go, but she did not feel comfortable speaking with me on the record for fear of political and otherwise retribution. Yeah, they're very worried that people won't work for the park.
Right.
They talked to me about how, the pay is not always great. It would be better in the private sector, but they've done this work because they love it.
Yeah.
They love, pulling people out of a campsite in a dangerous situation and then 2 hours later giving a young child a ranger badge.
Yeah.
I think one of the quotes was they work for the sunsets.
They get paid in sunsets.
They get paid in
yeah.
sunsets.
I love that quote.
Great quote.
Yeah. So not only might future would-be park staff dissuaded from doing this important, though not always lucrative work, but we're potentially losing institutional knowledge.
Yeah.
As people are pushed out, not in the national park, but also all other levels of government.
Yeah, and I think you have to think about the cultural messaging that's happening along with these cuts, which is a communication to the public that these are unnecessary, bloated positions, bureaucrats who aren't contributing to society, who, are inefficient, and that's why they're being eliminated. And that messaging was given personally to many employees who were terminated, saying that they were terminated because their contributions weren't needed, or they were found to have been performing badly, even though many of them had excellent performance reviews. So I think that messaging not only directly to employees, but to the public about the value of these employees is very damaging. And I think that also will take a long time to recover when you've communicated that public servants are somehow now being villainized for their service and taking lower paying jobs in the private sector because they care so much about working for parks or the country or the VA or whatever it is. That messaging, I think, is a little more nuanced, but is being internalized by a lot of people in the country, and that can maybe take a longer time to undo.
Yeah, well said.
A fear that I heard, speaking on the macro level, which really stuck with me, was a former ranger also talked about how, one of the worst case scenarios long term is that, let's say our national park, other national parks have a rough experience this summer and people are disappointed, trash bins overflowing, et cetera, and suddenly the powers that be in the future determine, well, these parks can't handle the work, and then they privatize services. And then we lose what, we've always called America's best idea.
Well, the Parks Department. And again, and we're going to talk about this in a second story too. I mean, just about some of these federal departments that are heavily, both sides of the aisle love these parks, right? This is not usually something that is politicized. So before we move on to that story, though, Jakob, I have to ask you, this is more than just the hiring, though. I was reading about credit cards being frozen so they can't buy toilet paper or trash bin materials, that kind of stuff.
As of a week ago, as I understand it, National Park staff, Sleeping Bear Dunes staff, who receive orders initially from the regional office in Omaha, their debit cards or credit cards, their federal employees have been frozen, so they can't make purchases more than $1.
More than $1.
More than $1.
Oh wow!
And the one person in Omaha who had the ability to supersede that and grant some kind of purchase, there was one person for the whole region.
Oh wow!
So no purchase, no more than $1. So my understanding is they can't buy toilet paper, and in the case of rangers, they can't buy ammunition. They can't. There's a million things they can't buy right now.
Wow!
So they're not ready for everyone to arrive in June or July.
Well, yeah, and that's usually May, June, July. You're talking May, June, July, August, right? That's the big bulk of summer.